Thank you very much, Michael. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming. For some years now, I have been tantalized by an idea. This idea, the idea of uneven and combined development. I didn't invent it. It was first coined by the Russian revolutionary Leon Trotsky back in 1905. I'm not the only person working on it. In fact, there's been quite a large revival of interest in the idea of uneven and combined development in my field of international relations. But although it's neither a new idea nor one that is as neglected as it used to be, I'm still tantalized by it. And that's because I feel that this is an idea with immense intellectual and perhaps even political potential that we're only beginning to tap through our research into it today. And tonight what I'd like to do is to tell you why I think that, explain why I think that is so. Now, some of you will have heard me going on about this idea all too much in the past. Sorry for that. Others will be aware of Trotsky's idea, but perhaps not familiar with the way it's been taken up in international relations. And I think probably for some of you, this may be your first encounter with Trotsky's idea. So my first challenge when I was thinking about preparing this lecture was, can I really deliver a single lecture that would be of interest to everybody, whatever their level of prior knowledge? And I pretty quickly came to the conclusion that it should be possible in this case, because this is one of those ideas which, although I think it's a very profound idea, it has lots of complex applications, but in the end, it's also a very simple idea. And the best exposition of it, at whatever level, is always going to be one that stays in touch with that essential intuitive simplicity and accessibility of the idea. Now, I would say that it's so intuitive that my son Yoshka, 2 years ago, when he was 6 years old, stopped me one day. We were walking down the street, and he pointed to a broken paving slab that I was just about to trip over. And he said, "Look, Dad, it's uneven, combined, and it's development because you're walking on it." And it's true that it is also one of those ideas that once you get it under your skin, you kind of start seeing illustrations everywhere. However, that does not mean that you can use it just to indicate anything or to illustrate anything. It has a very specific meaning, and let me give you, as a placeholder at the start, a kind of simple version of what it meant for Trotsky. And you can see it, I think, if you just look at the three components of the idea itself, the three key words. First, the world, the human social world, is uneven. It's made up not of a single society, but of many societies of different kinds, different levels of development, different cultures, different histories, different sizes, different power, and all the rest. That's the uneven bit. Secondly, this is not just a comparative fact about the world. These societies coexist in real space and time. And that means that they also affect each other, they interact with each other, they combine with each other. And finally, the last element of the idea is that that interaction and combination between societies is itself a driver of historical development and change. And if you don't factor that into how you try to understand the world, you're going to miss a lot, because a lot proceeds from the fact that the world is made up of many societies that are interacting. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, okay, we can see that it's simple, but what on earth is so profound about that? That's just obvious. Right? We know that. That's the problem with ideas that are both simple and profound, that if you make a simple statement of them without the context, without showing what were the problems that idea was able to resolve, then they can sound trivial and insignificant. So what I'd like to do tonight is to include this question of what's the problem that this idea could solve into my exposition of it. And I'm going to do this in four main parts. First of all, I'm going to set out this thing, what I call the problem of the international, which I think this idea really addresses. Secondly, I'm going to talk for a bit about how that problem presented itself to Leon Trotsky as a practical political problem in his experience as a revolutionary, and how that led him to produce this idea of uneven and combined development. After that, I'm going to raise the question of how big an idea is this? Is it simply something that relates to the particular things that Trotsky was trying to explain in his own day, or does it relate only to the modern contemporary world? Or did he in fact stumble on something that is of relevance to understanding any period of human history? And then finally, I want to come back to the present and ask, what can this idea enable us to understand about the contemporary world of the 21st century? Okay, now before I get on to the problem of the international, I want to talk for a minute about the fact of the international. And I want to suggest to you that the international dimension of the social world is all around us. Anyone that has been reading the newspapers over the last year could see the souring of relations between Washington and Moscow over Syrian chemical weapons, over the Edward Snowden affair, more recently over the struggle for political influence in Ukraine. They could watch the wranglings among leaders of the Eurozone countries debating what to do about bailouts and austerity. They would be aware of French military interventions in sub-Saharan Africa. One way or another, and much more besides, of course, one way or another, international politics is always in the news. But I want to suggest that this international dimension isn't just something out there. It's also a part of our public consciousness of ourselves as a national society. And this is something I think you can see also in the media. If you look at how frequently we find reports that compare British society with other societies, whether that's comparisons about economic growth or inflation or productivity, or whether it's about the efficiency of our public services, standards of education, and so on, or whether it's about standards of social justice, political rights, human rights, and so on. In all these ways, campaigners, politicians, academics situate British society in an international context in order to boast about it, criticize it, make demands of it. It becomes thereby an actual impulse to action within the society, because most of the time they're saying, look how we're falling behind other societies. This is what we need to do in order to keep up. But societies don't only interact through comparison. They also, of course, are materially interdependent, massively so. I mean, you can see that very easily. You just go into the supermarket and look at the origin of all the things that are on the fruit and veg stall. But that's a comparatively trivial example. If I go to the opposite extreme, this map shows the pattern of imports and exports of oil, which of course is the major source of energy in an industrialized world. And what you can see, the green parts of the circle are the exporting proportion and the blue parts are the importing. And when you study the map, you can see that in fact just about every society on Earth is fundamentally dependent on either importing energy or exporting it. If you cut off that international interdependence, all these societies sooner rather than later would simply grind to a halt. But then again, even the things that we most take to be the distinctively national achievements of a given society can turn out to be, in part, the result of interactions with other societies. What could be more English than the English language? But what is more commonplace than the fact that we know that the English language is a mixture of German, Latin, Norse, French, And we know also, as soon as we stop to think about it, that these are not just linguistic traces, they are actually the sedimentation of the influence of the Romans, the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, on the political and cultural development of this society. And I can give you a much, much bigger example than that. In 1620, the English philosopher Francis Bacon, who is generally credited with being the father of modern scientific method, asked himself, what was it that set off the early modern world of which he was a part? And he could see all the ferment and accelerated development going on around him by comparison with the Middle Ages that Europe had been in before. And his answer was that 3 inventions, gunpowder, the magnetic compass, and the printing press, had, he said, done more than any religion or empire to galvanize European societies, to raise them out of the darkness of the Middle Ages. Now, there are lots more, we could go on all night with these kinds of examples. So what are the points that I'm trying to make through them? Well, there are 3 basic points. The first is that the fact that the world is divided into many countries is a major and enduring feature of social reality. It's not a happenstance or a temporary thing. It's, so far as we know, a perennial feature of historical development. Secondly, the consequences of that fact reach right down into the very constitution of societies, what they are, and how they develop over time. And thirdly, for that reason, if you want to develop a social theory, a collection of organized assumptions and statements about the world that will help you to analyze what goes on in the world, then these 2 aspects of societies, namely their multiplicity and their interaction, really have to be a part. They've got to be built into your social theory. So another way of putting that more visually is that when we think about the social world, we shouldn't think about it like that, as a singular entity rolling forward on its own, as it were, through time. We shouldn't even think about it like that, sort of multiple but self-contained entities. We always need to incorporate that dimension as well, the interactive dimension. Now, the obvious response to this is, what nincompoop would be so remiss as to build a general theory of human societies that excluded this fact about them? The answer is, you'd be amazed. Contemporary social theory, of course, comes in 1,001 different varieties, but most of them are variations on the ideas produced in the tradition of classical social theory, running broadly from the 19th to the early 20th century. And that tradition is broadly dominated by these 3 figures, Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Emil Durkheim. And the amazing thing is that, of course, they knew there were many societies in the world coexisting. Marx himself, in particular, wrote a great deal about international politics. And yet, none of them, not even Marx, built those fundamental premises of multiplicity and interaction into their model of what a society is and how it changes over time. And that's not just a problem for some dead white European males. There is a whole contemporary tradition of writing, a whole group of writers who argue that as a legacy of this neglect in classical social theory, the contemporary social sciences are still afflicted by something called methodological nationalism. Methodological nationalism, by what they're saying is, throughout much of the social sciences, people, without realizing it, analyze the world as if the causes of historical development and change are entirely located inside individual societies. Theda Skocpol, just to give a couple of examples, she's probably the most famous living historical sociologist, she launched her career in 1973 with an article that was partly about this problem and which included a whole section that was called Wanted, an Intersocietal Perspective. We don't have one. We need to produce it. Zygmunt Bauman, in the, I think, 1991, contemporary social theorist, was still saying, 20 years later, that this remained a most urgent task faced by sociology. And another writer, one of my personal favourites, because his frustration at this comes so strongly through in his writing, he's really angry about it. And he comes out with these extreme statements. He basically argues that the whole of Western social theory has placed itself in fundamental contradiction to what he calls the well-known massive facts of history, meaning that we all know that wars and interactions between societies are fundamentally significant for how the social world has evolved. So how can we possibly leave it out of our theories? Now you may say, hold on a second, what about the discipline of international relations? Surely the existence of a discipline of international relations is where we look for a solution to this problem. Maybe it is the solution, because that's all about relations between societies. So let's have a look. Here's somebody that many of us, myself included, love to disagree with. But I think what nearly all of us would concede to him was first that he was very well worth disagreeing with, and secondly that he was probably the most famous international theorist in the whole post-war period since the Second World War. Which I think makes it really interesting that this man of all people would come out with a statement like this. Students of international politics have had an extraordinarily difficult time casting their subject in theoretical terms. What on earth does he mean? Ask any second-year undergraduate in international relations at Sussex, and they will tell you there is no shortage of theory in international relations. They have to spend 12 whole weeks going through one damn theory after another. Realist, liberal, Marxist, feminist, structuralist, post-structuralist, post-colonial, neo-institute, it goes on and on. It's a very crowded field. What does he mean? Well, the answer is that according to Waltz, these are not really international theories. What they are is theories of domestic society that people are using to think about international affairs. And Waltz went on to say that that's not a criticism of them, actually. They're not irrelevant or useless at all, because of course how governments behave internationally is often heavily affected by what's going on within their societies. But it's not enough. That was his point. Because in their international policies and behaviour, states, governments come up against other governments and have to deal with them, with what they're doing. And if your theory does not include that political multiplicity and its consequences, then when you use your theory to analyse international events, you will end up falsely reducing international phenomena to domestic causes. What Waltz had put his finger on, of course, was the knock-on effect in international theory of that problem of methodological nationalism that goes all the way back to classical social theory. But having done that, having identified the problem, Waltz, I think, took a wrong turn and ended up, in a way, in a dead end. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that when Waltz identified that there was a problem with social theory and the international, he didn't say, let's fix the problem where it is in social theory. He turned the other way and went off and produced a completely separate theory of the thing that social theory had excluded, namely geopolitics. And he advised everybody else to do the same. Students of international politics, he said, should concentrate on separate theories of internal and external politics until someone figures out a way to unite them. Now, the trouble with this was that although his separate theory, in its own way, was very brilliant in many ways, by definition, it was as incomplete, even according to his own argument, as the ones that he'd been criticizing. So they had produced a theory of society without the international, and he now produced a theory of the international without society. So we had two separate kinds, self-contained kinds of theory, domestic theory, international theory, that were incapable of reconnecting to each other. And yet even Waltz himself not only understood but proclaimed that ideally this was an anomalous situation. They needed to be brought back together. In an interview that he gave in 1997, he said this: "I don't see any logical reason why they can't be reunited. However, nobody's thought of how to do it. I've thought about that a lot. I can't figure out how. Neither can anybody else so far." Now, I think you'd be forgiven for thinking at this point we really have entered the Alice in Wonderland of the academics. Right, spinning their impossible, their intellectual problems, more or less out of nothing. Can somebody please tell me what on earth this intellectual problem has to do with anything in the real world of international politics? Here is somebody who indeed experienced exactly the problem that I've been talking about as a real political problem. Leon Trotsky grew up in 19th century Russia, and at the turn of the century, he joined the movement for radical change, the Marxist revolutionaries. But he soon discovered that this movement had got caught up in a mismatch between theory and reality. And the mismatch, it turned out, was all about the missing international dimension of their analysis. And it was that prompted him to produce the theory of uneven and combined development as a solution to exactly that problem. So let me tell you a bit about how what this problem was, the practical problem. I can see the slide has disappeared off the side of the screen, but essentially down here we have 18th century, 19th century, 20th century. So this is a timeline. And I put it on there because I want to suggest that if you want to change the world, it helps to have a kind of roadmap of kind of where you think the world is up to, what direction you think it's moving in, and how you can insert yourself into that in order to produce the change that you want to produce. And the Russian Marxists had such a roadmap. They took it from the Communist Manifesto written by Marx in 1848. In the Communist Manifesto, Marx, using England and the Industrial Revolution in England as his kind of case study or example, made an argument about how capitalism and industrialization was transforming society and what the direction of travel of that was, where it was headed. Here's the roadmap. So Marx argued that every society contains within it seeds of change. Nothing stays the same forever. In 17th century England, he argued, this process had developed to the point where there was a revolution, a bourgeois revolution, which overthrew the feudal state and opened the way for the emergence of a new kind of society, that was capitalism. Over time, capitalism would transform the remnants of the society it inherited from the past into two great classes: the bourgeoisie, the owners, and the proletariat, the propertyless workers. The social struggles between those groups would lead in the end to a further revolution, and that would lead, Marx believed, to socialism, a third kind of society. Sorry, second revolution leading to a third kind of society. Now, so far as Trotsky and the Russian revolutionaries were concerned, this second revolution was due any time now. And indeed, the Russian state was tottering. It was on the verge of collapse. The only problem was that Russian society didn't look anything like what the roadmap said it should look like if a socialist future was to be the outcome. Instead, it looked something like this, which was very perplexing. It was ruled over by a semi-feudal state, Tsarism, because it had never had a bourgeois revolution, as had happened in England. The bourgeoisie was so much smaller and more weakly developed that it was in no position to overthrow the feudal state, not least because in a bizarre twist of history, it was the feudal state that was orchestrating the process of industrialization. That, of course, was producing a proletariat. Inevitably, you can't have factories without producing a class of workers. The proletariat was far too small to play the role that Marx had envisaged for it in the roadmap, and yet, partly because its bosses were not liberal capitalists, but a repressive police state, the Russian proletariat was far more militant and revolutionary than its English counterpart, which ought to have been much further advanced down that road towards a revolutionary uprising. Russian industry was still far behind being in any way equivalent to English industry. However, because so much of it had been only recently installed, a lot of it was actually far more modern than most of British industry. And finally, this hypermodern industrial sector was sprouting up in the middle of a sea of peasants. It's no wonder that the Russian revolutionaries were confused. The roadmap couldn't even show them where they were. 6 months, in April 1917, 6 months before the Russian Revolution, Lenin, who was going, as you know, to be the leader of that revolution, still believed that such a thing was an impossibility in Russia, because it hadn't even had its bourgeois revolution yet, so how on earth could it have a socialist revolution? This was the conundrum that Trotsky innovated the idea of uneven and combined development to resolve, the political paralysis. And the way that he did it was to grasp that actually these two models are not separate from each other as they appear to be when you contrast them with each other. They are models of societies which coexisted in real time, which interacted with each other, and not only that, but Trotsky was able to show that it was the interaction of Russia with more advanced industrialized societies that had actually produced this strange differentiation or this divergence of Russian development from what it was supposed to be according to the roadmap. Now, before I go on and tell you the details of Trotsky's idea, there's one misunderstanding that I want to try and preempt, if I can. I think it would be understandable if some of you were sitting there saying, bloody Marxists, look how stupid they are, right? Of course they got totally lost. Look at this ridiculously unilinear conception of historical development and change. But we know that. We know that Marxism has long been criticized for having a unilinear conception of history. So surely it'll be nice if Trotsky's intellectual solution turns out to be interesting, but it's not really of any general significance because this is Marxism's problem. It's not ours. I think that would be a mistake. And it would be a mistake not just because of what I earlier said about methodological nationalism, but also because of the politics of it as well. In the early post-war United States, probably the most influential social theory that there was a theory called modernization theory. It was an adapted version of Max Weber's theory of modernity. And one of the most illustrious central figures in that was a man called Waltz Rostow. And Waltz Rostow in 1960 produced a book called The Stages of Economic Growth, a Non-Communist Manifesto. And that's exactly what it was. It was a kind of blueprint, it was an analysis and a blueprint that he had produced in order to guide third world societies so that they would modernize and become like Western societies. Now, almost right from the start, people made the same criticisms of Rostow's work that I've been relating to the Marxist roadmap, namely that it was a unilinear model that was based on a particular Western experience that was going to have a considerable difficulty in understanding the actual ways that third world societies were changing. And a very influential group, a counter-argument, grew up around a Russian emigre to the United States called Alexander Gerschenkron. Now, I want to say two things about all this. The first thing is that Gerschenkron never references Trotsky in his writings, and yet there are some uncanny similarities between the two bodies of writing, so much so that people who've read them both often conclude that something close to plagiarism must have been going on. But that's the smaller point I want to make. The bigger point is this. Waltz Rostow went on to become the National Security Advisor to the Johnson administration during the period of the Vietnam War. And in 1968, he published an article in which he argued that the carpet bombing of the Vietnamese countryside was historically progressive. And it was historically progressive because it was forcing the population off the land and into cities. And we know from history that that is a necessary step in the transition to modern societies. So what I want to say by this is that when it comes to the problematic politics of unilinear views of history, the Marxists are not alone in that. In fact, it's a recurrent trope or difficulty in the social sciences. Okay, so let me now move on to Trotsky's solution. The first thing that Trotsky did was to change the starting point for social theory. So instead of starting with an individual society, like in the roadmap, he started with unevenness. That perception that the world is made up of many societies that coexist. And he made the observation that when industrial capitalism first emerged around the end of the 18th century in northwestern Europe, its first effect was to radically deepen the unevenness among human societies because it catapulted the power capabilities of the Western societies that were now industrializing. So it opened up an enormous gap. And because these societies, that wasn't just a comparative point, they were societies, remember, that coexist in real time. For that reason, that gap gave rise to what Trotsky called a whip of external necessity. And what he meant by that was that ruling elites in other societies in the world were effectively on notice that if they did not rapidly change the course of their own society's development in order to try and imitate the new sources of power that the West was able to project, then they would lose their independence, as indeed virtually all of them did. You can count almost on the fingers of one hand the number of pre-existing non-European societies that actually preserved their independence throughout the 19th century. Most of them didn't. How on earth were these societies supposed to catch up? If you take the example of Russia, these are difficult things to measure, but normally statements are made to the effect that it would have taken Russia several hundred years simply to arrive at the point where Britain had been that germinated the first industrial revolution. And Trotsky observed that actually it was not necessary for Russia to reproduce the course of development that had produced the Industrial Revolution in England. And that was because of a second international consequence of historical unevenness, which he called the privilege of historic backwardness. And what he meant by that, again, of course, backwardness has all these connotations about looking down on people, but it's not really the point here. The point here is about coming historically after something has been produced elsewhere, and therefore being able to import it and use it, to insert it into your own development without having to reproduce the developmental process by which it first came into existence. He has a very colourful, not very politically correct metaphor for this, where he says at one point, savages throw away their bows and arrows all at once for rifles without travelling the road that lay between those two weapons in the past. Which is true, actually. And I assume he was thinking of the experience of American Indian take-up of rifles. So here is a situation where you can, as a result of coexistence in real time, you can have a massive compression and acceleration of development. So now we have two causes, a whip of external necessity and a privilege of historic backwardness, both of which break all the rules of how development is supposed to proceed if you were to assume that it was self-contained within an individual society, or that the whole world was one society. And as a result of that, of course, Russia's industrialization was proceeding much more quickly than had been the case for England, very like the case of China today. And yet, Russia was not turning into another England. And the reason for that had to do with a third concept in this theory, combined development. And this is where it all becomes, I think, really interesting and dialectical, if you like. Remember that the premise of uneven development entails that you have coexisting societies that are internally at different stages of their own history. The consequence of that for 19th century Russia was that when the whip of external necessity was imposed by the sudden steepening of unevenness of international power relations, there was no politically independent bourgeoisie in Russia that was capable of orchestrating industrialization. But somebody had to respond to the external threat, to the continued independence of the society. And when the Russian semi-feudal state used the privilege of historic backwardness to launch a program of industrialization, of course it wasn't looking to create a liberal society. It was looking to extend its own survival. But what that means is that a semi-feudal state is using the techniques of advanced capitalist technology and organization. The two are becoming intertwined. In effect, a new kind of society is being produced that is neither the pre-existing Tsarist one, nor is it turning into the English one, which is being selectively imitated. Now, once Trotsky had grasped the interactive logic of this situation, particularly this point about how it could produce unpredictable splicings of different developmental temporalities into each other, he was able to use that to explain all those weird and wonderful peculiarities of Russian development, why it had diverged from the roadmap, why it had the particular form that it did. But how did that solve the political problem? Well, the answer is that combined development turned out to have three interrelated meanings. The first meaning referred to what happens when you import advanced technologies into a pre-industrial society. Effectively, you combine different levels of development, levels of technical development. The second meaning referred to the combination of different forms of society as the spread of capitalist industry fuses with different forms of society, pre-existing society in the other parts of the world that it's expanding into. But there was a third meaning of combined development, which was the combination of all these societies themselves into a larger developmental whole. What Trotsky drew from that was a further concept, which he only used once, but I find it so evocative. For me, it really completes the theory. Because what he observed was that for reasons that had to do with these international causes, the whip of external necessity, the privilege of historic backwardness, the way that this scrambled the social structures of the societies involved, the more capitalism was expanding into a world system of production and exchange, the more it was incorporating into it strange, contradictory hybrids like Tsarist Russia had become. And the more the integration of those hybrids was modifying the overall structure of world development. So that in effect, instead of the world increasingly looking like an enormous version of the roadmap that we saw earlier on, it actually came more and more to resemble an interconnected hybrid, a single social structure, but not one that you could kind of draw out of any conception, any singular conception of an individual society. But it was now all completely interconnected. And what that made Trotsky realize was that, yes, indeed, it was the case, that there was no way that the social structure of late Tsarist Russia could produce a socialist revolution. That was indeed a complete fantasy. As it turned out, it was the fantasy of Stalinism that came later, which Trotsky never bought into. What it might do, however, a Russian revolution, because of all those interconnections that now existed, it might have the effect of triggering revolutions in the advanced capitalist countries, which could then initiate a wider process of world change towards socialism. So that may all sound like incredibly pie in the sky. So let me just bring it down to the ground and say, I think it's an almost incontestable social scientific proposition, which is that just as the emergence and spread of capitalism as a form of society has an international dimension to it. It's uneven and combined. It's not a unilinear process. It doesn't happen everywhere at the same time, producing the same result everywhere. So the same would apply to any transition beyond capitalism into whatever kind of society will exist in the future. And I do think that unless you believe that capitalism is the only kind of society in the whole of world history that will break the rule that societies are not fixed things, they always gradually mutate into something else. If you really think capitalism is going to last forever, then, okay, his argument is not going to be very persuasive. But if you don't think that, and if you do accept the premise that the international coexistence of societies makes a difference to how social change happens, including on a world scale, then actually I think the argument that revolution itself must be uneven and combined really follows logically from the earlier steps. So I think that what Trotsky had done here was to produce something that Waltz said he couldn't work out how anybody could do it, which is to produce a social theory that is at the same time an international theory. Oops. Sorry, I just have to catch up here. So, the next question for me is, how big of an idea is this? We have to raise the question because probably most people who write about this idea reject the notion that it applies before the period of modern world capitalist development. And they have, in some ways, very reasonable reasons for holding that. But of course, if they're right, if the phenomenon of uneven and combined development is simply a byproduct of one kind of society, then it's not going to do the work that I say it can do. It's not going to be a general incorporation of intersocietal interaction into our theory of the social world. And we do still need that incorporation, if only because of this, which is a 3,000-year-old diplomatic note sent by the king of the Canaanites to the Egyptian pharaoh, and which I think provides at least circumstantial evidence that the multiplicity of societies and the interactivity of social development is not something that just came into existence suddenly in the 19th century. And in fact, Trotsky himself has a couple of scattered remarks in his writings where he comes out with statements like this: unevenness is the most general law of the historical process. It's a formulation that puts a lot of people off because they think this is some kind of mechanical, teleological, structural thing, whereas actually I think it's not those. Let me explain. I think that if you take a snapshot of world development at any period of human history, this one is from the 16th century, you will find what this map is essentially saying. What this map shows is the different colours represent the different forms of human society that are coexisting in the world at that time. And what it shows is that really, well, look at the distribution of the colours, right? It is kind of literally the case that the biggest fact about that image is its radical unevenness. Right? They're not all the same colour. They're not distributed according to any kind of geometrical pattern. It all looks kind of semi-random, although there are climatic explanations for some of them. It's a tapestry of several different kinds of human society which came into existence at different points in history and which now coexist, as I say, in real time. So very quickly, the brown and the purple bits are the great state-based centres of power of the time, the empires and states. all of them based on different regional civilizations, different ways of organizing society, different languages, different cultures, religions, and so on. But the world isn't only made up of states and empires. To the north and the west, the pink areas, the nomadic pastoralists, tribal societies moving with the seasons, living off their herds of livestock. The light brown and light green areas, settled communities of farmers, organized by in tribal or family ways of the kind that anteceded the first emergence of the state as a historical form. And there are even some areas down in Australasia and then in North and South America and in the Far East that are still yellow. Yellow is the areas that are still populated by hunter-gatherer societies. And of course, these different forms of society are in interaction with each other. The steppe populations of Eurasia, those nomadic pastoralists, periodically erupted into enormous campaigns of military expansion and devastation, overwhelming the surrounding civilizations. In the 13th century, when Marco Polo visited China, he found that it was ruled by the Mongols. The Mongols had completely overwhelmed China and ruled it for 100 years. And of course, there was lots of interaction of various kinds between the so-called civilized areas. I mentioned earlier on the indirect transmission of those Chinese inventions, gunpowder, magnetic compass, and the printing press to Europe. But of course, by this stage, Europe had also received a highly significant transmission of ancient Greek learning from the Arab world that played a very significant role in helping to stimulate the European Renaissance. And at this point, the Europeans were in the process of conquering the Americas, an interactive process that was going to fundamentally transform both their consciousness of themselves in the world and also their material capabilities, because they were unlocking vast reserves of gold and silver bullion that they would use to buy their way into the Indian Ocean trade of Asian societies that were still more technologically advanced than the Europeans were. So I'm saying that even something as really fundamental in creating the world that we know as the rise of the West has a powerful interactive dimension to it. Trotsky's own society, Russia, originated in the 10th century in a fusion of two completely different kinds of society. At that time, a branch of the Scandinavian Vikings called the Rus settled in what is known today as the Ukraine in order to secure their trade with Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. From that relationship was born the first Russian state. And from that relationship, Russia also acquired the Cyrillic script, the Eastern Orthodox religion, the Byzantine code of commercial law, and so on. It didn't have to reinvent those achievements of Byzantine civilization. It could use, as it were, the privilege of historic backwardness to take them on ready-made. You can take this argument all the way back to the earliest civilization that we know of, ancient Sumer, where for the first time we see the development of writing and cities and so on, was located in southern Iraq on a floodplain that was great for agriculture, but useless for the raw materials such as stone, timber, metals that were going to be central to the development of Sumerian civilization. The only way that that civilization could crystallize there was in part through its interaction with surrounding hinterlands and communities that could supply that. So what conclusions am I drawing from all these examples? Well, I draw three conclusions. The first conclusion I draw is that Trotsky was right. Unevenness really is a universal fact about human history, and it really therefore ought to have been part of of our theories of history, of our ways of understanding how the world came to be what it is. Secondly, the whip of external necessity and the privilege of historic backwardness are continually generated by the multiplicity of unevenly developed societies across history. I think in a way they, through those two kinds of causation, the unevenness of development underpins two of the most fundamental problematics of human societies, the problematic of security and the problematic of difference. And finally, what does all this tell us about international relations? Well, I have to be careful here. I can't say that this shows that international relations goes all the way back, because of course nations are a modern form of political community, nation states. But actually I would want to make an even bigger point. I'd want to turn it round and say what it shows us is what modern day international relations actually is. It is the modern form of the political multiplicity which has been a perennial feature of human history because of the unevenness of development itself. So what about today? What can this idea tell us about life in the 21st century? Well, we don't have to look very far, do we, to find striking examples of combined development. In Saudi Arabia, a tribal form of political rule has been grafted onto an industrializing society with the effect that an extended family of 7,000 princes own the state that owns the wealth of that society. A significant chunk of the world's energy security rests on the stability of this peculiar hybrid. And maybe we didn't need the events of 9/11 to tell us that hybrid, was capable of producing extremely dangerous side effects. In China, a communist party is presiding over the most enormous capitalist industrial revolution that the world has ever seen. In Iran, a theocratic revolution that has no precedent in Shia Islam, let alone the textbooks of Western social theory, is engaged in a massive protracted standoff with the great powers of today over its use of advanced nuclear technology. All of these are central to the contemporary, to international affairs in the contemporary period. I think they all show us, none of these could have come into existence simply by virtue of internal development of a given society. All of them have been created by the pressures and opportunities of international interaction, and then have been woven into the wider social structure of humanity that is the modern international system. So what about that social structure of humanity? What is the overall shape today of uneven and combined development? Well, I think that, in a way, the key driver of it is the same as it has been for the last 200 years. That is to say, the radically uneven character of industrialization as a global process, uneven across space and uneven across time. And here, sorry, this has gone off the edge again, but 1800, 1900, and the year 2000. And what I want to indicate through these images is that in the 19th century, the major effect of the unevenness of industrialization was an unprecedented outcome, which was that one region of the world dominated the rest in an incredibly short space of time because of the lead that it had, because industrialization had not taken off quickly enough elsewhere. But it also that unevenness also created not just European world domination, but also a geopolitical roller coaster inside Europe itself, as other societies, particularly Germany and Russia, in different ways, began to catch up with English industrialization, but on the basis of very unstable patterns of internal combined development. In the 20th century, the internal contradictions, geopolitical and social, of that regional pattern of combined development exploded first into 2 world wars, and then as a direct outgrowth of the case that Trotsky analyzed, the Cold War, which dominated world politics right up until the 1990s. And finally, in the 21st century, of course, it's the delayed industrialization of mainland Asia that is bringing an end to the Western age of world history as we have known it. Central to that process, of course, is China, a country which, from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, endured a whip of external necessity that was so intense and so prolonged that they call it the century of humiliations. China today, as we know, is industrializing even more quickly than other late developers, Russia, Japan, Germany, before it. And like them, it is also scrambling the sequence of social development. So a Tsarist monarchy orchestrating industrialization was weird enough, but a communist party bringing into being a capitalist industrial economy is the strangest outcome of combined development so far, I think. And I think it's impacting on the social structure of humanity in 2 main ways at the moment. One is it is driving a geopolitical revolution as the United States tries to disentangle itself from accumulated commitments in Europe and the Middle East in order to complete its so-called pivot to Asia, in order to adjust to the new reality, so that the rise of China is a direct result of the timing of its uneven development. But also, it's not just a geopolitical impact. The relationship between Chinese industrialization and the Western economies has, I think, played a very significant role in the economic crisis that we're still living through now. And what I mean by that is that, as we all know, from the 1990s onwards, a tidal wave of cheap manufactures generated by China's export-oriented industrialization strategy had an enormous effect in countering inflation in the Western economies. And at the same time, Chinese government purchases of American Treasury securities kept low the price of borrowing, the interest rates. The consequence of those two was surely that it prolonged the economic expansion of the 1990s and beyond, with the effect of much, much higher levels of private and sovereign debt when the boom finally collapsed in 2007 to 2008. I'm not saying that China caused the economic crisis. What I'm saying is that it is a natural, it's in the nature of uneven and combined development that relationships form between advanced and rapidly developing societies. In the process, new social formations are created, new patterns of combined development. And if we want to think about what happens next, about the future of the world system, then it must be not by thinking about capitalism in itself as an individual form of society, but rather by understanding the particular causal structures that have now been created by these global patterns of combined development. I've one last point to make, and my last point moves away from the global political economy, but in some ways, for me, it's the most tantalizing point of all. I said earlier on that international relations today is the form taken by uneven and combined development. But in the logic of the idea, it cannot be the only form. Or to put it another way, I think we can use this idea of uneven and combined development to track the influence of the international far beyond international relations. What I mean by that is that if we take seriously this premise of coexisting, interacting societies, then it must follow that it's not only the economics and the politics and the technologies that are interacting. That coexistence must involve interactions across all the dimensions of human social existence. So it must include literatures, philosophies, religions, ideologies, cinemas, music, all the ways in which different societies mentally and imaginatively produce their cultural worlds, as well as organizationally and physically produce their material worlds. If that's true, then it should follow that we can use a version of Trotsky's idea in order to analyze the different national traditions of all these things and understand the role that interactions between societies have played in producing all the different national forms of literature, music, philosophy, whatever. I think if we do that, it will reveal that this interactive dimension to human history has not only been a constraint and sometimes a threat, but also a fundamental source of human creativity and innovation. If so, then I think it follows that Trotsky's idea can speak right across the social sciences, but also the humanities. It can even, I think, act as a bridge between them. I think the consequence of that is that I have to end this professorial lecture, my inaugural lecture as a professor of international relations, with an irony, which is, it may be that the final wisdom of the idea of uneven and combined development, an idea that can do so much to render intelligible international relations, is actually that if you really want to profess the international, you have to embrace much more than the discipline of international relations. Thank you very much.